I don't know what.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening. My name is Kiana Washington. I am a member of the board of directors of the Contra Costa County Bar Association and also vice chair of the DEI committee. Welcome to our 4th annual Racial Reconciliation Forum. We are really excited to have all of you here and to engage in this great discussion. I am a criminal defense attorney at Valiant Law Firm in Walnut Creek. We do plaintiff civil rights as well. This evening, we are pleased to have with us Mika Domingo and Veronica Rios Reddick. We're hoping that Judge Judy Johnson will also join us shortly. And so I will just introduce the two of them and get a little bit into the topic that we are going to be discussing today. First, starting with Mika Domingo. Mika is managing attorney at MS Domingo Law Group, PC, a firm focusing on estate planning, probate, trusts, and estates administration and litigation and conservatorships. Prior to her legal journey, Mika was a finance auditor and owner of her own publishing firm. Mika is committed to helping increase diversity in the legal profession, has served on numerous boards, including the chair of the Judicial Evaluation Committee for California Women Lawyers for the past 7 years and is incoming president. Veronica Rios Reddick works as a deputy district attorney for the Alameda County District Attorney's Office for over 12 and a half years. Veronica currently serves on the Alameda County Bar Association's Criminal Law Executive Committee, Racial Equity Task Force, the Advisory Committee of Centro Legal Use Law Academy, and Contra Costa County Superior Court Internal Bias Committee. Veronica is the 2022 ACBA Distinguished Service Award as a government attorney recipient, 2021 recipient of the Marquee Who's Who Emerging Leader Award, and the 2018 recipient of the Minority Bar Coalition's Unity Award. She earned her JD from the University of California Hastings College of Law, and she received her BA from University of California, Berkeley. And I don't see Judge Johnson yet, so hopefully when she pops in, I will introduce her as well. So this forum started, I see Judge Reyes, I'm going to be giving him a shout out. This forum started years ago when prior to the pandemic, if anyone can remember back that far, where at the DEI committee, which was at that time known as the Diversity Committee, we had a discussion, and Judge Reyes was vulnerable enough to explain a situation that he had, and he also explained it at the forum, so I'm not outing him in any way, but he had when he first became a judge, and he was sitting in court observing, and an attorney came up to him and asked him if he knew who his public defender was. Even though he was dressed in a suit and even though he was newly appointed to the bench. And so that kind of sparked a discussion, and we're going to be continuing that discussion, and it very much dovetails into the topic that we have today, which is on invisibility. And so I just wanted to kind of throw out some statistics here to kind of put this in context. According to the Department of Labor statistics, in 2020, men made median annual income $10,435 more than women. Black women made a median annual income of $10,522 less than white women. So that would, if you're doing math, that would put Black women about $20,000 plus, close to $21,000 under men. Latino or Latinx women made a median annual income of $15,013 less than men, and Asian women made $14,711 more than white women. Average annual salary for Black lawyers is $9,087 less than white lawyers, while Asian lawyers make $15,568 more than white lawyers. And so that being said, I wanted to ask the panelists, what does it mean to be invisible or have less visibility in the legal practice context?
I'll go first. For me, working as a prosecutor, there's always an assumption that I'm the court reporter or I'm clerical staff. Never have I been asked, am I attorney, even though I dress fully in a suit, professional, not getting the same treatment where, prosecutors, defense attorneys go back in chambers, the judges who I've appeared before numerous times, not remembering my name. I've had law clerks that I've been supervising because they looked a certain way. The judge would ask them their opinion before mine, and I was supervising them. So it's been unfortunately a consistent and ongoing battle for me to overcome the hurdle and the assumptions that I don't belong. And a lot of times that I'm invisible. And I think what's been great recently is the discussion of implicit biases, because I think it really allows people to start to acknowledge, because I think it's too difficult for individuals to really accept that we do all have explicit bias. That's the reality of it. I think implicit bias is a little easier to swallow. And so people can say, oh, well, it's not, I don't mean to do it, but maybe I am doing it. But these kind of forums, these kind of spaces, these kind of discussions are so very important, because I think the first step is acknowledging that it's happening, because for so many of us, it happens on a daily. It's something that we consistently deal with. And for certain groups, they have no idea it's happening. Or if they do, they don't acknowledge that it has impact, the level of stress. One thing that we discussed in our pre-meeting was like working from home and how much, well, I loved it, because there's a lot of, no microaggressions, no issues. You just get your work done and that's it. It's a very different experience depending on what you look like, especially in the legal profession.
Thank you for the question, Kiana. So to me, feeling invisible is similar to just being a rock. You take up space, but you're not being heard. You're not being seen. And on the basis of, it could be on the basis of your gender, your age, your race, your religious background, your culture. And it's the implicit bias that we experience. Unfortunately, the sad truth is that we do live in a society in which stereotypes about groups of people are ubiquitous, and it follows that almost everyone has some implicit bias. Almost all of us experience being invisible in one way or another. There are so many different kinds of implicit biases, as the most experts, and I'm not an expert on it. I can only share as to what I've experienced. But from what I've experienced with the different types of implicit biases, those can reinforce existing inequities and stereotypes, and it insidiously and automatically seeps into a person's behavior. And I experience it almost on a daily basis. And when I was a newer attorney, I may have experienced, and I did in fact experience a lot of it, but I was not always aware, or I was oblivious, or I chose not to say anything, not to speak up for various reasons. So being invisible has effects, long-term effects on a person's, or feeling invisible has effects on a person's work, interactions with other people. And I'm really happy that we're talking about what that means now, because oftentimes we don't want to, because it's uncomfortable, but it's part of who we are. I'm willing to own my own truth, even if it makes others feel uncomfortable. There's the good and the ugly, of course, because the good and the ugly are part of our story.
Right. Since we're short of panelists, I'll jump in as well. What I shared in our pre-meeting preparation meeting was that this whole concept has kind of had a very momentous impact on my career. I started my career in the public defender's office, and I mean, there were definitely issues in the Contra Costa public defender's office where I started, but I'll skip over to when I worked in the Sonoma County public defender's office. What was explained to me when I started was that, they basically had a seniority system. First in time was first in right, which to me seemed kind of fair. You'd move up. And for those of you who don't know how government pay structures work, is there are, same for the DA's office, but also for the PD's office, there's a PD1, PD2, goes all the way up to 5. And then within those classifications, there are steps. And so, each step increases your pay, and each classification. So if you go from a 1 to a 2, that increases your pay. And so kind of this is the connection that this makes to the statistics that I gave at the beginning. So everything was going along swimmingly, and then a male attorney was hired, and he was pretty much groomed to be promoted. So promoted in our context was just from misdemeanors to felonies, which was kind of the big thing for us, to go from doing misdemeanors, which is kind of a grind, to being a felony attorney. And so all of a sudden I noticed that this person who happened to be this male attorney, who happened to be my office mate, so I had a front row seat to this, was being handed felony cases to try. And then I noticed, well, I didn't notice, it was announced that even though he started about 6 months after me, and I had been quite an accomplished trial attorney from the very beginning. I won my first trial. I won a bunch of trials back to back, to the point where I just didn't think I could lose. And so it was a pretty hard blow when I did finally lose a case. But so I had really accomplished a lot. And I was just kind of waiting my turn in line when I see this person get promoted to felonies over me. And a lot of people came to me after that happened, and they were like, well, what about you? And, it felt awful. And it really changed how I felt about working there. I went from being very happy working there to eventually just leaving. And then when I went to the San Francisco Public Defender's office after that I did the same thing, because that's just kind of my nature. And I reached a point, I finally got promoted to felonies, and I reached a point where I tried a bunch of felony cases successfully, which is very hard to do as a defense attorney. And then I asked, I went up the chain of command. We kind of had a military structure there, and finally ended up talking to the public defender and his chief attorney and saying, I want to do murder cases. I've done these other cases, life cases, and been successful at that. And that's what I want to do. And I think I skipped a little step, but I went to my supervisor and he said, there's this list. And he's like, he lists 3 men and he's like, they have to get murder cases before you get murder cases. And one of the men on the list was someone who had not tried very many cases. 2 of the men on the list were not very successful trial attorneys. They had been there for a long time, but they were not very successful. And one tried very few cases. I think by the time he left the office, he had only tried 2 felony cases, and they were handing him a murder case before me. And I tried double-digit numbers. And so that contributed to me deciding I'm leaving. That's why I went into private practice. And so for me, in addition to what Veronica and Mika have shared, it's also about having your accomplishments overlooked and having colleagues. I mean, one of the male attorneys in the homicide context was a Black male, and the other 2 were white men, and having their accomplishments valued more than yours, even if objectively, if they looked at the numbers, it just wouldn't add up. And so not only can it mean, when someone gets promoted from misdemeanors to felonies, that they're making more money. And if men are being valued more, they're making more money. They're getting these very real pay increases. But then there's the complexity aspect that also goes into it. If you want to do certain types of things to kind of round out your career, and those opportunities are being given to men who have not established the same level of success that you have, it can be quite crushing, and it can lead to not only just less pay, but also to less job satisfaction. Okay, it looks like we have Judge Johnson. Welcome, Judge Johnson. Let me just do a quick intro. Judge Johnson is now retired, but she received her Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from Stanford University. She received her Juris Doctor degree from the University of California, Davis. Prior to becoming a judge, she worked as the executive director for the state bar and chief trial counsel for the State Bar of California. She also worked as chief prosecuting attorney in discipline in California, and assistant district attorney at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office Special Prosecutions Unit. She has worked as a staff attorney at Legal Aid and an instructor at New College of California. And then she was appointed to the bench in 2012 and assigned to the Pittsburgh courthouse. Judge Johnson currently chairs the De Anza High School Law Academy Advisory Committee in Richmond and participates in a variety of civic and professional activities, too numerous to mention. Welcome, Judge Johnson. The topic or the question that we were responding to is, what does it mean to be invisible or have less visibility in a legal practice context?
First of all, let me apologize. I was in logon hell there for a moment and had difficulty joining in a timely manner. I think we have, many of us have all experienced what you're talking about, Kiana. I frankly come to this as someone older than most of the folks I'm assuming on the line or involved in today's discussion. And so I actually date back to a time of more overt discrimination, where people will actually tell you why you as a woman or a minority were denied admission, a position, or a promotion. Again, I've literally been in situations where I was not even recognized as an attorney, let alone perceived as invisible. Often talked to as the, while in court, not being admitted beyond the bar into the well of the court, because I was perceived as a non-lawyer. So again, I date back to a time where this was a more overt form of discrimination, where I literally was told I would not be promoted because men in my office needed the extra money that came with a promotion because they needed to support their families, whereas I was a single person. So again, I'm happy to respond to more subtle forms that I've experienced, but I have a long history with this issue.
Sure, thank you. And Judge Johnson, we're getting a request from the audience to see if you can angle your camera up so we can see your face a little bit better. Or down, I guess it would be down. Thank you.
All right, is that better?
Yes, thank you. Okay, and so the next question is, and some of the responses already touched on this, but what experiences have you had with invisibility in your legal career?
I can answer that. When I worked for a private firm, I was a second year or third year attorney, and I was the only female attorney. And my boss and his partners and other attorneys who worked on cases with me, they oftentimes had their happy hour meetings in the office, and I was never invited. And I thought maybe at first it was because they had known each other longer, but I could hear sometimes the conversations, and sometimes they revolved around some of the cases that I was also involved in. And I tried to make excuses. I tried to justify why I wasn't invited. I thought, well, maybe it's because they know I don't really drink that much and they wanted to have time to drink with each other. Or maybe they were incorporating their fantasy football and I wasn't into that. But the fact was I just wasn't invited, and it's for various reasons. And it really made me feel like I was not part of the team, but I was doing the work, and sometimes most of the work, since I was taking the lead on a lot of those cases.
I feel like I have too many examples, unfortunately, but the one that came to mind was doing misdemeanor rotations and felony rotations. We would have weekly meetings with the trial team, and we discuss our caseload, get input, talk about offers, witnesses, strategies. And oftentimes in those meetings with our supervisors, I would have a lot of follow-up questions, because just being born and coming from where I come from, just because a victim says it, like I always wanted corroboration. I always understood that, you know, officers don't always tell the truth. Witnesses don't always tell the truth. So I always sought additional corroboration and had follow-up questions. But a lot of times in the meetings, I would get ignored. People would tell me to, you know, just relax. And, you know, the case was like clear cut, slam dunk. And I would always have more questions. It wasn't until I got to an assignment where my supervisor was very senior in our office, and he started to notice that my colleagues would come to me for trial advice. And he would even ask me if I thought we would get a guilty verdict or not. And I was consistently right. I would say guilty. I think it'll hang 11-1, because I would watch. I liked watching as much as I could when I wasn't in trial, because I felt like I learned so much from watching my colleagues and more experienced attorneys in my office. It wasn't until he started to say in the meetings, he's like, you have really good trial vision. You have a really good understanding of what jurors want to know and want to see. After that, and him actually telling others, my assignments after that, people would start to ask me and actually listen to what I was saying. But that was after maybe 3-4 years being in the office. And then again, it took a period of time once I got elevated to felonies, because it took me a long time to get elevated to felonies. The reason why I joke that I'd still be trying misdemeanors if it wasn't for a judge. A judge literally called our chief assistant at the time and said, what is she doing trying misdemeanors? She's amazing. And I was on the very next transfer list. So it's really unfortunate that these things happen and that they're still happening. And I completely agree with Judge Johnson. It's not as overt at all. A lot of it is a lot more implicit, but it still remains that it's happening. But again, that's why forums like these and discussions like these are so important, because we have to acknowledge it, and not only acknowledge it, but a call to action on what we're going to do. And for us, those of us that have experienced it, we know it's happening. Like this is like, you know, we all are nodding as the other one's telling the story, because we've all had a similar experience. It's more important for our counterparts, our allies, when they see things happening, they need to say something. They need to stand up. They need to say, hey, you know, Mika should be invited to the bar after work. Why isn't she being invited? I mean, that's what needs to happen. And I think that's the missing piece. Because we all, you know, if you joined in, I think you have a certain sense of this is an issue. But the real issue is getting those of us that don't think it's an issue to start realizing that it is.
I think you raise a very good point. One of the challenges that we face as women and people of color in what has historically been and quite frankly remains a mostly white male dominated profession is, how do you know when this is going on, when there's some form of bias that is actually occurring, or is it some flaw or weakness in yourself? And for us, we always have to ask that question. Is it bias or is it us? For the most part, white males don't have to ask that question. They are presumed to be competent. They are presumed to be excellent, whereas we have, there are issues of doubt that often surround us, either in our own minds or frankly in the perception of our colleagues. Are we the affirmative action recipient of a leg up, and therefore not deserving? Or are we as qualified, if not more qualified? Those are questions that we are often confronted with, that we have to resolve, that can be very, very stressful. It's a dilemma, a problem, an onus that we must bear, that others often do not. And so it is very difficult sometimes to understand exactly what is going on in your situation, and then how to manage it. If you are always perceived as the person who's griping, who's claiming discrimination, there's a price to be paid. And if you're silent and never contests, there's also a price to be paid. And so one always has to weigh the relative disadvantage and potential gain of whether to complain or not, because you don't really know. And the more subtle as it has become in recent years, this issue, the more difficult it is to actually pinpoint what is going on. And so that is an additional kind of burden or challenge that we shoulder. And that is why allies are very important, because they can often tell us, they are often privy to conversations about us that we are not, and can pull our coats to what is going on, or be champions for us in much the same ways that Veronica has identified as the judge who championed her abilities.
Those are great points. You know, I do think it does make it much more challenging confronting these issues when they're more implicit as opposed to explicit. And definitely that has been a huge barrier to dealing with any of these issues of visibility is, you know, explanations may be given like, well, you're just not management material, or I just don't think you're ready for this, or things of that nature, that it makes it really hard to confront. But I will say that I have in my career, I've been practicing for 18 years, dealt with some explicit, and that's a little bit more, it kind of comes out like a shark to bite you when that happens. I received an email when I was working in the Contra Costa Public Defender's Office from my supervisor. I was BCC'd on an email that she sent to the head public defender, who was a male at the time. Many of you might remember him, but I guess they'd had a conversation in the grocery store where he said he only intended to hire one Black attorney as a trial attorney, and that I was not going to be that Black attorney. And that really sank my battleship. I just can't even tell you how it felt to read those words on the page and to realize that someone had just come out and said that. Like, you know, I guess he had a maximum quota. And then I've heard stories after that from other attorneys where that he told, oh, you're too old for this, or I'm not gonna hire you. Because in Contra Costa, the way they did things, I don't know if they still do this, is that a PD1 was a temporary attorney, or 90-day attorney, and then a PD2, which was felonies, which was a permanent position with benefits, higher pay. You would have to go through the whole civil service process. And so some women who had really worked hard and, you know, working in the Contra Costa Public Defender's Office and misdemeanors is a true grind. And they were told, well, I'm not going to hire you because you're pregnant. Like it's almost as if he was daring them to sue him. But in that situation, it's easy or easier to see a way out. But, you know, what I thought about in my situation is like, okay, so I'm going to start my career off by suing the boss. And so, you know, it pretty much, even though obviously there was a witness, he had this explicit conversation with this person. Like, what was I going to do about it? I thought about that and I just didn't have the guts to do it. So that brings me to my next question. What are the barriers to visibility in a legal practice setting?
I think you hit it right on the nail, is your legal reputation. There's been many times in my office where I've been confronted with situations where I may have felt it was a hostile work environment. It was overtly raceless, implicitly racist, sexist, misogynistic. But the concern was, if I sue, I'm ruining my career. I'm ruining the trajectory. If I make too many waves, I'm never going to get any good assignments ever again. In fear of retaliation. Even when going head up with a supervisor about direct orders. And we talked about this, Kiana talking about, seemingly to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that she would head up these issues, a lot of them. I didn't have the courage to do that. When I would get like direct orders from a supervisor that I felt was inappropriate for a case, I would navigate around that by either informing the court and defense counsel, and a lot of times cases would plead open, understanding that my offer wasn't my offer and I couldn't go any lower. Although I felt there was mitigation, although I felt there was proof problems, I always try to be upfront and honest about what I have and what I can prove, because that's just the way I was raised and who I am as a prosecutor, and that's what you're supposed to do. But I think there's a genuine fear of putting yourself out there, being treated differently, and suffering negative repercussions, because I saw that happen to people. The people that spoke up or sued or did anything, I mean, they left. They would be forced to leave. And I wanted to continue the work, because I think for me, what was most important was what I was doing, not necessarily who I was working with. And that's what I always focused on. But I think that I did a disservice to those that came after me by not speaking out, because perhaps by the time they came in, things would have changed. I do think there's been a lot of progress overall, but I still feel like we have so far to go, because people are still being mistreated. And for me, it's not about equality, it's about equity. And equity takes into account that some of us were disadvantaged from the start. So we need to make up for that time, for that loss of effort that we all deserve, being a working mother, being a woman of color, being, someone from the LGBTQ community, being trans. I mean, it's just, there's so many different groups that are marginalized, that feel invisible, and that are taken for granted. And I think the invisibility is very situational, because I'm a woman of color and I feel a lot of times treated invisible, but I'm sure there's been times where I've made someone else feel that way. And I think acknowledging that you're not always the victim is really important, because I think we're also perpetrators. I know there's been times where I haven't treated people the way that, they should have been treated, because I was stressed out, I was upset, I was irritated, got a bad ruling, whatever the case may be. And that's no excuse, but I think that it's important to think about it overall, how we are impacting. And Kiana, I also wanted to ask, at some point, one of the people in the chat talked about examples of how allies can assist. So maybe if we can bring that into the fold of examples of what we think would be good calls to action for our allies.
I will be dealing with questions. I mean, I think we'll probably have at least half an hour to deal with questions. So I did notice that. Thank you.
As far as barriers to invisibility, I can speak to denial. Sometimes you're aware that it's happening, but you don't want to talk about it. It's not just because you're afraid of what could happen if you talk about it, but it's almost as though you're ashamed that it's happening to you and you don't have anybody who can relate to it. That can really get in the way of getting the reality out in the open.
What are your thoughts, Judge Johnson?
Well, yeah, again, I go back to a more ancient time in which, quite frankly, we did not feel we had remedies, and we did not feel we had allies. And all we could do was suck it up and be better. And again, you can question the decisions that we made. But what I would emphasize to this group is, again, the tremendous burden that it places upon the individuals. In my career, I probably eat more shit than most of you. When I was a young woman prosecutor, one of the first women prosecutors in the DA's office, actually in the Bay Area, but certainly in the DA's office in San Francisco, there was a sign on the back of our office door that said, "Gentlemen, before you enter the hallway, don your jackets." And the assumption was that, of course, all the people who were in those offices would be male. I mean, gentlemen, don your jackets. I mean, I had a jacket because at that time, we were required to mimic males and wear suits. But the message was very, very implicit. And we didn't feel that we had a choice. But what was required of us, and the mantle that we thought we had to shoulder for a future generation of women lawyers and prosecutors in particular, was to be better than our male counterparts, which required, of course, in tremendous effort. It meant that we could never be unprepared, that we could never be late, that we could never be wrong on the law. And it just required a Herculean effort on our part to shoulder those responsibilities, while at the same time, we were just like everybody else, in relationships, having children, and never getting a break for any of those lifestyle concerns. So I think it took a tremendous emotional toll on us. We all became fast friends because we were similarly situated and oppressed. And there was something to be gained and had from that experience. And hopefully we did open doors for people. And now I think, for example, women prosecutors probably are 50% or more of the lawyers in most DA's office, but in particular in DA's office, it was perceived as unseemly that women could be litigators in those offices. You might even be a public defender because that was perceived as, I don't want any public defenders to take offense, but certainly by the guys in my office as sort of nanny work. But to be a hard charging prosecutor was just something that was seemed to be incompatible with the views of what women should be. So again, I would just emphasize the toll that it can take when you're trying to shoulder this burden, and why it's really important that we address it, because it is very, very difficult to shoulder that burden and be a normal human being, and not leak somewhere along the process. So these kinds of forums I think are important. I do think it's important that we get to a discussion of how we bring allies into the mix to be supportive, and how we also need to be supportive of each other. The other kind of contradiction that I can speak of is that there were some women who kind of joined the males who said that the way to get along was to be just like them, to be as big of an asshole, if not bigger an asshole than our male counterparts. And, you know, that was not the way that I chose, but many people did, because that was an easier way to survive. I know that there are African-American lawyers who were, prosecutors who were more gung-ho and more punitive in their views of prosecutions, because they felt that they had to prove that they were not sensitive to communities of color in order to succeed. And again, I think part of the rationale for diversity within the ranks of, again, I'm focusing on prosecutorial agency because that's my experience, but the rationale for our inclusion is that we do bring some empathy and understanding of the circumstances in communities of color. That's one of the rationales for our involvement. And to then suggest that in order to get ahead, we have to forget all of those things is very, very troubling.
You know, I that raises some good points. I think one of the big barriers to visibility has to do with stereotypes. You know, there's women in particular, but also other people of color just deal with these stereotypes. I can't be this, I have to be less that, or I need to be more this. I've definitely had a female judge suggest to me that, I don't know if she was suggesting that I do it, but she said back in her day, we would, you know, go and flirt with the DA and get the deal that we needed. And this was a former public defender who's now a judge. And so some of these stereotypes, I think, are a huge barrier to visibility. And I would also add, this comes up a lot for corporate attorneys in large firms that, you know, female corporate attorneys, but I think it's also relevant to all levels of legal practice. Or all aspects of legal practice, is there can be some sticky points when it comes to mentorship. Again, going back to the explicit barriers, I not too long ago, probably like 2 or 3 years ago, maybe three years ago, because it was pre-pandemic, there was this senior defense attorney, private defense attorney, who had a lot of sway, and he had season tickets to the Warriors. And he mentioned, oh, I should take this male attorney. I mean, he didn't say male attorney, he said the person's name, but to a game. And I said, well, what about me? I'm a fan. And he was like, oh no, my wife would never go for me going to the game with an attractive woman. And you know, I mean, I guess you know, it could be viewed as a compliment, but I saw it as just kind of a door slamming in my face, because a lot of these, you know, ways that your career is advanced is through mentorship. And some of that mentorship, you know, I mean, there's the proverbial golf course, but, you know, sporting events and things like that. And if those senior attorneys are not willing to engage with you because you're a woman, then that kind of denies you an opportunity that men in particular are receiving. And I also actually ended up being the same man that was going to get invited to this game, but he told me that when he worked at the DA's office, he was one of few Black attorneys there. And he said he was never invited to anybody's home for like a barbecue or a party. or dinner or anything like that. But and there were very few Black attorneys there. And so he felt like it was very isolating because the white attorneys were inviting each other over and they were socializing, which is another way that you kind of, climb the ladder, so to speak. But he was never included in that. And kind of goes back to what Mika was talking about. If you're not being included in these socializing opportunities, mentorship opportunities, then that really stifles your ability to get ahead. And I do want to kind of, my next question that Judge Johnson kind of alluded to is, how do you think allies can combat disparate treatment in the legal practice?
I think if you see something, say something. In Mika's example of not being invited to the bar or to the after work event, someone in that group noticed. I mean, she's the only one not getting invited. Someone in that group needs to say, hey, let's invite Mika, or just invite Mika. In my example, in the trial team, where, I'm asking questions and I'm getting shut down, someone needs to say, no, these are valid questions. We need to figure this out. We need to really know if we're able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Because as a prosecutor, for me, the best prosecutors think like defense attorneys, because you have to be prepared for all the counter arguments. So if we're not even willing to talk about that, it's just not the best practice, in my opinion. Another example would be like if the judge comes out and has all the attorneys come in, but they're all the male attorneys, and the judge doesn't think I'm an attorney. One of those male attorneys that I work with that are prosecutors that know I'm a prosecutor need to say, no, Your Honor, Veronica is also a DA in our office. She has a case and she's ready for trial. Instead of just ignoring it, walking in and acting like it's not happening. I think a lot of people are kind of in their own world and worried about themselves, but I think we're at a time where we need to work together. Another example would be, if I see a coworker who is getting mistreated by a supervisor, saying something, acknowledging it. If the supervisor says something appropriate, and say, well, you shouldn't say that. You're just acknowledging it when it happens. You have to speak out. You have to stand up. Because a lot of times the person that is the victim of those actions feels alone. And I can't tell you how empowering it is to have someone, especially if you're not friends with them, to speak out and say, hey, that's not okay. Because the more people that do that, that will change the culture of an office. Offices continue to be this way because no one says anything. Or maybe one or two, and they get shoved out. But it needs to be a culture shift for everyone in the office, not just the victims of these situations. People need to band together because we all at some point feel marginalized. We've all, like, a boss that's chewed you out has probably chewed out 20 other people. So you just really need to understand that we're not alone and work together, and there's power in numbers. That's what it comes down to. If there's 30 people saying something's a problem, it's going to be looked at differently than if it's this one sole person that they could just say, oh, well, she's sensitive, or she's too emotional, or, she can't cut the mustard. But the more people that speak out, the less likely that behavior is to continue.
I think allies can really help you if you're not aware. It can help you cultivate awareness of your own biases, help you identify what they are when you don't recognize them, and help you identify and evaluate your own. There's also the idea of stereotype replacement. And when you recognize, your allies can help you recognize that a response may be based on a stereotype and consciously adjusting that response. I've heard of the term called counter stereotypic imaging, where when you recognize that you're stereotyping, what you do is you try to imagine that individual as the opposite of that stereotype. Allies can really help you with that, because sometimes you're not really aware, or you're in denial, or you're afraid you can look at the person and see, your eyes can help you see a person as an individual rather than a stereotype. And it really helps if you take the time to learn about their personal history and the context that brought them to the space where they are, whether it's in your office or a club that you belong to. There's also the idea of just really looking at the perspective. Your eyes can help you put yourself in the other person's shoes.
What are your thoughts, Judge Johnson?
Well, I basically agree that there's nothing worse than the feeling of isolation, that you are in this by yourself. And again, it's almost one of those Kafka-esque moments where you don't know what is real and what is not real. And having an ally, having someone who is either similarly situated or who is not, but sees the same thing that you see, is very, very important for your validation. And it's something that has saved me, throughout my both personal and, professional life, just having one person to say that you're not in a unique situation, because the more unique the situation, the more you tend to internalize it and feel that it is your fault, that you've done something wrong, that you have failed, that you are wanting. And to the extent that someone else can validate those feelings and help you understand, and sometimes, let's face it, it may be you. It may be some failing in you. But that ally can help you see that and hopefully overcome it. And if it is not you, that ally can help validate what the circumstances are and can help you to try to manage that situation.
Great.
I also just feel that, one of the problems that we have in our profession is that it tends to be just such a dog-eat-dog profession. We're in law school. I don't know. Again, I was admitted in 1976, so I'm an old geezer. I don't know if they still say this. Look to your right, look to your left. One of those people ain't going to be here next semester. There's something that has historically been inherent within the legal profession that says, I gotta hunt, and if I hunt, nobody else eats. And if somebody else eats, I don't eat. And so we tend to be very caustic and antagonistic toward one another, rather than seeing each other as simpatico, as being in the same place, and each able to achieve their goals when we help one another, as opposed to when we always best the other person. I will tell you that I've certainly seen it in between the Contra Costa DA's office and public defender's office. It's as if sometimes everybody forgets the victim and the defendant, because the lawyers are so at war with one another, and the offices are so at war with one another. And sometimes it's just important to be able to step back and have a perspective that everybody can win, and it is not always the victor takes all. And I think that's there's something that is endemic to the legal profession, that makes having allies more challenging, because we tend to see each other as individuals at war, rather, you know, and that somebody's got to be the victor, and on this day it's going to be me, as opposed to saying that we all could be winners. And it's part of the thing that it can be very alienating about our profession, and frankly that drives a lot of people away from it. And I think that if we can cure this or ameliorate it, we would have a better profession. I've always said that the legal profession is the last great plantation, where whoever is, you know, on the top of the hill has no empathy with those on the bottom, and will exploit to no end. And sometimes that exploitation comes with great rewards to the people being exploited, but they're still being exploited. So it's, I think part of it is the dynamic within the profession itself, that we have to overcome, and we have to overcome it by being human beings and being empathetic to one another. And I know that's very kind of idealistic, but there it is.
I would add to that it's been tremendously helpful to me, and sometimes a double-edged sword, but helpful to me to have somebody kind of shine a light on the discussions that are going on outside my presence. And so, you know, in the example that I gave about I'm only going to hire one Black lawyer, I would not have known that discussion happened. And so there would be a lack of validation. You know, I might even just be blindly thinking, okay, you know, what is this, you know, does this have to do with me? You know, what can I do better? And just kind of breaking my back to try to prove myself to somebody who I'm never going to be able to prove myself to, because that person sees me as just a Black lawyer. I will add that person was also a Black lawyer, but it doesn't even matter. And so if without somebody there who participated in the discussion and heard these things to kind of validate my perspective and tell me, okay, this is what happened, this is why you're not getting to where you want to go, like I just wouldn't know that. And that's happened a couple of times where somebody has told me, okay, this is the discussion that happened in the room, and I believe that it had to do with bias, either because explicitly things were said, or, you know, here's a list of the things that happened, and, you know, the people were fighting against you in favor of this other white candidate, even though everyone acknowledged that you had stronger qualifications. I mean, it hurts when you hear that, you know, and it's very demoralizing to hear that somebody has discriminated against you based on race or gender or both. That's demoralizing, but it does kind of validate you and make you not feel like, okay, maybe if I just try harder, you know, you can never really outrun your identity. Your identity is what it is. And so I found that to be helpful, but I've also found it to be helpful when the person didn't just, you know, act as a fly on the wall, they did something about it. And, you know, sometimes in certain circumstances, they've changed his perspective by calling it out. They've said, okay, I believe that this person is being discriminated against, or, you know, because everybody agrees this person is a stronger candidate, yet you want this other person in the position instead. And so kind of what one way that I see is allyship as helping is to be an advocate and to kind of check your own biases. You know, if you're participating in a discussion and you notice like, okay, there's a Black candidate and there's a white candidate, and everybody's being excessively harsh on the Black candidate, you know, perhaps you should ask yourself if that's what's going on. And maybe you should also ask the room if that's what's going on. Because that's something that definitely happens. And if nobody's there to say anything, you know, the person's just going to get a thanks but no thanks, and they're not, you know, maybe they should have been put on the position. And maybe, you know, I think that it's important to be intentional, you know, because you do have these groups of people that are homogenous, racially homogenous and gender-wise homogenous. And, you know, if that is the situation, to kind of be intentional, like how can we bring in people that don't look like us? And that's commonly what we call affirmative action, but affirmative action was really just meant to say, like, you're going to make intentional efforts because people favor people that look like them. That's just psychology. Like, that's just psychology. And so if you never have diverse groups of decision makers, then you never have a real opportunity at diversity unless you are intentional about it. If you're always picking the people like, oh yeah, I know that person, we play tennis together, and that person's going to get the promotion because you know them and you live next door to them. But then there's groups of people who have been excluded from your neighborhood, you know, then you're never really going to get to know those people. So maybe you should, you know, as an ally, kind of ask yourself, what can you do in an affirmative way? But I mean, you gotta kind of have to walk the line, because I've seen people take it too far and they, you know, kind of treat that person as a token. It's like, oh, look what we got. And, you know, that doesn't feel good either. But those are my thoughts on it. And at this point, what I would like to do is open it up for questions and comments. And so what would help in that discussion is to use the hand raising function. And for those of you who are not super savvy with Zoom, if you just go to the bottom of the page in the reactions section, or little icons, a little happy face, and then it at the bottom of, like, a box will pop up if you click on that, and then there's the raise hand function. If you can raise your hand, I think that will put you to the top of the box here, and then we can acknowledge you. Don't everybody speak at once.
Well, while people are thinking about their questions, let me say something about some strategies for managing this. First of all, I think everybody should go out of their way to get some training on implicit bias. There is the presumption that people of color or women don't have any biases and they don't have anything to gain from the process, and that the onus is on white males, when in fact we all have biases. The example that Kiana gave of the person who plays tennis, let's say at a country club, and wants to hire fellow tennis players, well, they're probably discriminating against high jumpers or runners because they're more comfortable with tennis players. And so we all really need to, as part of our decision-making process, is understand what potential biases we may bring to that process, and consciously make an effort to screen out those biases, which is a hard thing to do. And again, we all have them. I think one of the reasons that the implicit bias concept has gained such traction is that no one wants to feel that they're overtly racist. Some are, but most are not. but all of us have these sort of built-in biases. And we have to consciously work as part of our decision-making process to filter those out. I know as a judge, you know, I would be sitting there and looking down, and the prosecutor would say, well, this person is really scary and they did all these things. And I look down at the person and I see basically a homeless person who may not be particularly attractive, but doesn't look particularly scary to me. And it's all of the things that are associated with people who are not educated, who don't look like us, who don't come from our community, who may not share our values, that are things that we mobilized against the person. So I think one of the things to do is to really look hard at how it is we make decisions and to what extent we have, and again, all of us have them, these built-in biases, and work to keep them out of to make our decision-making as bias neutral as possible. And that can only happen if we actively engage in a thinking process where we are searching for our biases. If we become complacent, our biases will come to the fore.
I have another example. When Kiana was talking, it made me think about allyship and how important it is to, if you're in the room when a colleague's being discussed, letting that colleague know. I started having kids right before I got promoted to felonies. And, you know, it's very routine after work for everyone to go out after work. And I couldn't because I had to pick up my child from daycare. And I would miss a lot of the networking and a lot of the talking about cases and kissing up to the boss time because I had a pickup time and I had to get my child. And there's often times where people would come to me and say, well, you know, everyone was talking about you because you never come. And, you know, and I appreciated it because it made me understood why I was getting treated differently, because I would I would hang out during lunch. I would, you know, the days that I didn't have pickup, I would try. And it just made me realize that I was wasting time, valuable time that I could have been spending with my family, because it wouldn't have made the difference, because I realized having kids wasn't the problem. I got treated the same way without kids. It just gave them more of a valid excuse. That I wasn't networking outside, or, you know, not attending the socials on the weekends, or, you know, whatever the case may be. I got to the point where I just wanted to do my job and leave because I didn't feel comfortable being myself, because I felt like it would be judged more harshly than some of my counterparts. I wouldn't be given the benefit of the doubt the same way as some of my counterparts. Oh, I see a hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
I specialize in legal malpractice, and I don't run into either male or female members of color. And I'm just wondering if you people have a suggestion how I could be mentoring, because I've been practicing law longer than anybody here in this panel. And Judge Johnson, despite your 76 entry, I've been doing it a little bit longer than you. And I'd like to be helpful, because I'm listening to these stories. When I went to Hastings, there was one black guy who played bridge, and there were about 7 or 8 of us who played bridge. So he was in the group, and we've been lifelong friends. I can't tell you how many times my pal has rescued me or my kids, because he was a judge, and there were times when. By the way, I helped him get elected because I raised money for among many of my friends. And but he's paid me back so many times, it's ridiculous. You know, one of my kids went off the rails. I brought him to him, And he made it pretty clear that those rails better be fixed. So, but the point I want to make is that I'd like to be a little bit more useful. And maybe, I mean, Kiana, I've listened to you, and I'm an ex-PD. I got tired of losing. I wasn't as good as you. I mean, I lost a lot. And I just couldn't handle it anymore. And I left. But things changed when I became a civil lawyer. And I learned something which I'm sure you know, and I've heard it suggested. Don't let anyone out prepare you. There's always something that you haven't expected. You know, when you're peeling the onion, you better peel the onion before you get into that courtroom, because otherwise bad things will happen. So that's it.
Thank you. There is a comment in the chats about some suggestions. Leo.
I had a question about, we've been talking about allyship, and oftentimes I feel like we're being reactive instead of proactive. So when we hear something or we see something that's wrong, we presumably, you know, you try to do the right thing and help someone when you see that there's something that's wrong. But how do you suggest more like proactive? I feel like the people who really need to be here probably aren't. And so how do you reach those people? Sometimes I think to myself, I should be maybe joining groups that have opposite views of me, just to try to reach those people. And so what do you recommend in terms of reaching those people proactively and trying to get them to realize? Because the hardest, the most demoralizing thing to hear is, well, you're so woke, or that's just, you know, man up, or whatever it is. But how do you recommend trying to reach those people?
I have a response to that. I think it's really, really important in our workspaces for it to be as diverse as possible. So if you work for a firm or you work for a government agency, it's hiring, because that type of behavior is, I think, committed often because they're the majority and they feel comfortable, or they're in positions of power. But if the boardroom looks a little different and is a little more diverse, I think people would be less inclined to freely spew out comments that make others feel invisible. And it wouldn't be like, oh, the one African-American female prosecutor. It would be the sea of color of prosecutors, or defense attorneys, or civil attorneys, or corporate, you know, attorneys. It's just, we need more diversity of perspective, thought in these spaces in the legal field. I think that's a proactive way of dealing it. In your space, make sure that it's diverse, because people feel comfortable saying crazy things when they are the majority. I think what really introduced me to this concept is when I went to UC Hastings. I went to UC Berkeley. I was a Soc major. You know, I took ethnic study classes, Chicano studies classes, Afro, Soc. Most of my classes look like mine. And I went to Catholic schools, but they were pretty diverse for Catholic schools. When I was in Hastings, some of the comments that my students would make, I was just taken aback. I'd never been in those spaces where people felt comfortable saying things overtly racist in class. And it was under the guise of, we're discussing the cases, but it blew my mind away. And I used to wonder why, like, how can you say that? But it was because there were so few of us in the room. At UC Berkeley, that would have never happened, you know? So it just, at least in the parts of that I chose to be in. So I just really think it's important for you to diversify the space that you are in, and making that your mission, that there's as many people as possible representing as many groups as possible, because it's not just women or women of color or men of color. It's everyone, because you need to get more perspective on your choices and the options that you're making.
Thanks. Marjorie.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. This has all been really, really enlightening, and just so many things that I heard the attorneys of color mentioning, I've also experienced, I go back to Judge Johnson's era, so, as far as being in the profession. And but one of the things that I really think it's great about the comments about the ally ship, and I actually, and as far as being proactive, I also think that it really helps to think about that before, think, how would I react if somebody said something like that? What would I say to them? And because I think I saw it in the comments so often, people are really like in shock because they can't believe that somebody said something so racist or so homophobic or so ageist. Like how could they possibly say that in 2022? And just for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a car accident and my car was being towed about 100 miles. And I was in the tow truck with the tow truck driver. And this guy just starts talking politics, and he just made all these assumptions about me because I'm white. And it was so amazing to me. And I just was being real, like the nice little old lady sitting in the back. And I said, oh, I just can't imagine how racist everybody still is in this day and age. And, and we actually had a fairly good conversation. But he was saying all this stuff that I know he would never say to me if I wasn't white. So I just thought it was really, that's just an example. Oh, but the other thing is I did have a question to him. And that was, I was so taken by Kiana's statistics on Asian women attorneys making more than white women attorneys. And I just wondered if there was some explanation for this, like in terms of the areas of practice or something that would explain this, because that I've never heard that before.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know the answer to that. It might be a combination of factors. It's a little bit beyond the scope here to talk about the whole concept of model minority, and those types of stereotypes that impact how people are evaluated. But yeah, that's a great discussion to continue to have. Natasha.
Thank you so much to everyone who's been participating in the panelists. It's been really great. I wanted to suggest something. I've been working with California Judges Association for a couple of years now, as the head, the committee chair for the Northern California section. We put on programs for law students, and we sort of go over self-care, because a lot of these biases and these things have an effect on our nervous system, and our stress and anxiety really ramps up. And then also we go over different skits and scenarios that show microaggressions, that show overt or implicit biases, that and how to deal with this, and how to talk about it, and how to be an ally, or how to deal with it if it's happened to you personally. So I feel like there needs to be more training for law students as well, so that when they do hit, the legal profession, it's like we're equipped to handle some of these things a little bit more, or we're more mindful, or we shouldn't feel any shame over it, and understand how to handle these things. And then also how to take care of ourselves when something does happen, and not to feel that shame and guilt that Mika was talking about, because that's very harmful, I think. So I think there needs to be more work in the law school sector too, to prepare yourself for when you do become a lawyer. So I don't know if anyone wants to talk. I'm willing to connect, and you guys can, when we put on another program, I would love to have some more attorneys who want to help out with that. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Dorothy.
Well, I wanted to start off by just saying thank you to all of the presenters and moderator for sharing your stories. It really helps to hear what other people are going through. One suggestion that I had that has helped me is that I took this online course in bystander training. And what they teach and what they talk about actually pertain, it helps when you're talking about allyship. Some folks will freeze up, some folks are scared, some folks are angry, but the idea is, you know, we're lawyers, we know how to prepare for things. We do our research. And so if you have some training in advance as to various techniques you can use, for example, they have a template, which I don't recall the words exactly, but it's 3 Ds, things like distract, document, things like that. And so there's a whole range of things you can do if you see an incident. If it's safe for you to intervene, you can try to intervene. If it's not safe for you to do that, no one's asking you to put your physical safety at risk. But at the very, very least, the one thing you can do is after the incident is over, go to the person who was victimized and just ask, are you okay? You know, I saw what happened. Are you okay? And so because there's a range of behaviors that could be supportive, it frees you a little bit of the guilt of, oh, I should have said something or I should have stepped in. So it can free you of the guilt, but make you more comfortable with going up to someone and showing some empathy. And that can be helpful as well. So that was just something I was thinking about as people were talking about allyship and when can you speak up and when can you try to make a difference, even if you're not the one directly impacted. And I have found that to be quite helpful in terms of speaking with other folks to try to get them to see without, you know, kind of getting in an argument. I sometimes bring that up, not in the context of race necessarily, but just in the context of, you know, looking out for other people. And sometimes they'll get it. They'll understand that, oh, there's something more at play here. So just a suggestion I'd like to put out there. And that's exactly the organization Right to Be used to be called Hollaback. And Veronica's put that in the chat. That's exactly the organization that does these multiple trainings.
Thank you so much for your feedback. And thank you everybody for being here. Thank you everybody for sharing. I want to thank the panelists and for all the work that you put in, as well as the level of vulnerability that you all showed talking about these issues in front of a group of people. That wraps up our Racial Reconciliation Forum for 2022. Thank you so much for attending again. And if you want to get involved in the DEI committee, we're always welcoming others to get involved, and we're always looking for other programs. And so Natasha, I think you are involved, but you know, I look forward to working with you on some programs. And anybody else who has an idea. I mean, this started as an idea a few years ago, and here we are in our 4th year. So you too can, you know, can further the conversation. So with all of that, have a good night. Thanks for attending, and I'll see you guys on some other program in the future.